from where I'm sitting, I should hold my hands up and say you're absolutely right that as an educated, middle class, white Western woman, it's probably been net positive for me. In fact, it's almost indisputably been net positive for me. I mean, as you rightly say, there are many eras in which I wouldn't have been given the opportunity to make this case. That's beyond dispute, and it's clear when you look at the numbers, when you look at how life changed for bourgeois women like me in Britain and America alike with the arrival of the pill. It's very clear that for women of my class and education, it was an absolutely radical transformation. Women piled into the universities in huge numbers. Women piled into the workplace in huge numbers because it was possible. You could plan, and it just wasn't possible to plan before, because you either had to have the self-discipline of a nun, or just accept that your career could be interrupted by a child at any point, which just makes it, well, put it this way: you're not going to be looking at in the same way at a 5 or 10 year professional development plan if you could fall pregnant at any time and have your work trajectory interrupted. So it made a huge to ambitious academic nerdy women like me. It made an immense difference, and so we have to weigh that on one side of the ledger and say, yes, there were a huge number of women who benefited immensely from being able to control our fertility in this way. But inexorably, with freedom comes trade, and the point where sexuality, women's bodies in particular, stopped being managed via social norms and social codes. Because I mean, the sexual double standard is real, and it emerged for a reason. I mean, for very practical. Historically, it's been pretty brutal, and the shaming of women who fall foul of sexual norms has historically been pretty brutal. But it was done for a very pragmatic reason. If absent reliable contraception, everybody around you really does have skin in the game in terms of what you do with your body and who you have sex with. This is obvious. And so you can complain all you like about how it's patriarchal and unfair, but from the point of view of everybody else in your village who's otherwise going to have to figure out what to do with the baby, you can sort of see why people got there and how these social norms emerged. And then at a stroke, along comes this technology that says, actually, you just don't need any of that anymore. So all of a sudden it became thinkable for the first time ever that women's bodies, nobody did have any say or any stake in who I chose to have sex with. It became thinkable for the first time ever, and an entire infrastructure of social codes and courtship rights and the immensely complicated business of older, usually sort of purse-lipped older matrons like I am now, doing their best to stop horny young people from getting overexcited, at least until they were married, all just disappeared, and it became possible to think of my body just belongs to me. And before that just wasn't a meaningful statement to make, because in the case of women it wasn't really true. But the downside, and so this is great if you're like me and you're academically ambitious and you want to do X, Y, and Z with your life. If you're poor and uneducated, and all of a sudden your body belongs to you, you still fall within the larger field of the larger moral field that's been transformed. But you maybe don't necessarily have the same set of things that you might want to do with yourself and with your suddenly newfound freedom. However, you still have the same freedom to do what you like with your own body. Now let's say you're very impoverished. Let's say you don't have very many prospects. Let's say you're under great financial pressure. You have this thing that belongs to you, and something that belongs to you can dispose of as you see fit. So all of a sudden, along with the huge opportunities for capable, ambitious women at the top of the social hierarchy, what came with that was the libertarian defense of the sex industry, which in practice ended up being a libertarian defense of the sexual exploitation of impoverished women. In a way which had been, has gone on since time immemorial, but could suddenly be justified with using the same rubric as was used to emancipate women to go off to get PhDs and join the medical profession or whatever. So along with freedom comes trade, and what it is that gets traded isn't necessarily just going to be women's immense professional potential in the market. It turned out in practice to sometimes also just be women's bodies.
I agree with almost everything you just said, starting with the fact that people appear to have no idea what the logic of sexuality was even about, right? I'm frequently struck by the fact that people seem surprised to discover that sex is itself a fundamentally reproductive thing, which in humans has been elaborated so that it does some other jobs. But if you don't understand the rudiments of sex as reproductive, then you don't understand why all of the asymmetries arose around it. And it is those asymmetries to which modern folks are in general in rebellion. But it is very different to be in rebellion against them if you know what they're for, and you know, it's a Chesterton's fence problem, right? Those things existed for a reason. I very much agree with your point that birth control is the first step of transhumanism. I did not realize that until you said it, but it immediately struck a chord that transhumanism begins with the ability to control when and how frequently you reproduce. And that is, in my opinion, a powerfully good thing to have control over. But what did not come with it was any sense of how many things were downstream from it. So there was no ability to generate a new kind of wisdom about, okay, given that a woman is now free to choose when to reproduce, what else that, you know, was once part of a coherent way of organizing a society is now suddenly going to be cut adrift. And where we find ourselves now is in a kind of painful, counterproductive chaos in which people have gained sexual liberation, but they do not appear to have gained sexual satisfaction out of it. They just have a kind of technical...
On the contrary, in fact.
Right. They appear to be addicted and dissatisfied en masse, which suggests that there's something. And, you know, again, I would point to the question of, is it inherently a mistake to engage in technological family planning? I don't really believe so, but I do think that what we did downstream of that change has been, I won't say an unmitigated disaster, but it's been a mitigated disaster. There have been many positive things, but wow, have the consequences for human flourishing been mixed.
I think that's absolutely right. And I really want to emphasize again that this is not about me just saying we have to turn the clock back and we have to put all of these technologies back in their box, because A, that's not possible, and B, the social mores that we had before are now so completely gone, and have evaporated with really the generation before my mother's generation. Perhaps my mother's generation was the last to hold really to pre-sexual revolution mores in any numbers, and we're a long way along from that now. And things have changed so radically even since I was young and at the sharp end of the quote unquote sexual marketplace, which is an idea which I dispute, in its as a frame for what sexuality is and how it functions and how it ought to function. I think the fact that it's become normalized to refer to the process of mate choice and mate formation as a sexual marketplace. We could spend another hour unpacking what that term means and why it's such a category error when it comes to what sexuality is for and how we should be thinking about it. But I think it speaks volumes about what exactly we're getting wrong, and how it is that we're thinking mistakenly about it, to think of it as a marketplace, to think of it as something which is individualistic and transactional, and in which everybody must of necessity be pursuing their own interest. That's just a fundamentally mistaken way to think about what sexuality is and what it's for, and how it can be used, how it can be a healthy and beneficial part of who we are as humans.
Well, I would push back very slightly. I think I agree with the sentiment, but I would argue that this is a case where what sex breaks down into, if you disrupt the higher version of it, is a marketplace, right? That
Yes.
it's a lower state of existence, and it's very hard to make the case, especially to people who are addicted to some product produced in that marketplace, that they have given up something, the name of which they don't even know, right? That there is something.
Well, yes, this is exactly it. Sex shouldn't be a marketplace, but it is.
Yes.
This is where we are now.
Very well said. Yeah. Sex shouldn't be a marketplace, but it is. And it is interesting. I don't know. My social group is, of course, idiosyncratic, but it is interesting how frequently I am now running into the pattern of women, let's say in their mid-30s and onward, waking up to their own philosophical error, discovering that things that they were convinced of, they now believe were not in their interest, and making a radical change in their trajectory, which I think is very positive, but it's also a bit tragic that it comes late. In other words, that something about the messaging that society is delivering to these women when they're very young is irresistible. And, how much better off? Well, I will make two arguments. One, it would be great if you had that wisdom early on so that you could avoid the pitfalls earlier in your life, because it's not that those costs go away entirely when you wake up, right? Some of those costs are just simply permanent. But that it is also the case that in order to understand why this sexual marketplace that things have broken down into is so pervasive, one need only look at the plight of an individual woman, especially who attempts to opt out, right? In a world where people have become very transactional about sex and effectively have started swapping in quantity for quality, not realizing that they've given something up, a woman who decides not to make that error has very little access to anyone's attention. And I believe it is that tragedy that makes it impossible or not impossible, but very unlikely for the culture to substantially correct its course, right? It's a vicious cycle.
I'm cautiously optimistic on that front, but I think it will take a wholesale mutiny by the next generation of hot girls.
Yeah,
it's pretty much a huge amount of culture is downstream of what the hot girls want.
I 100% agree with you. That is exactly right. And the problem for that opportunity is that those hot girls now have access. The hottest girls can monetize that hotness in a way that is disproportionate, and therefore they are disincentivized to do so, because effectively they may have given up something in terms of human satisfaction and well-being, but they've gained a tremendous amount of earning capacity, which is misleading to women who don't have those opportunities. It's like NBA stars leading people to think that, if they play the game really well, that they're going to end up rich, when the answer is no. That's only true for people in the very tail of a distribution. It's not true in general. So I worry about.
Yeah, time will tell. To be honest, the worst case scenario is as you describe it. The hot girls go on setting a terrible example for everybody else. A more optimistic scenario sees enough of a backlash that also has a trickle down effect. And I see, to be honest, I see evidence of both, and I don't know which way it's going to go yet. But I'm cautious because I choose to have hope for humans generally. I prefer to think that enough women are going to wake up and decide that this is just not working.
Well, I guess I would put my hope. I would put my hope somewhere slightly different. I put my hope in people like you and Louise Perry and Bridget Fedesi and my wife Heather Hying, who are presenting a very powerful case that is not, I mean, even in your framework, which does argue for a rejection of modernity in, I think, no uncertain terms, even in your case, you are not really laying out the case for a return to somewhere in the past. You are laying out the case that many of the things we have abandoned from the past, we did so at our peril, and that we should think about how they might be recovered, which I think is the right way to look at the puzzle.
I think that's right. I found a wonderful quotation from the Colombian aphorist Nicolas Gomez Davila, who says, "The true reactionary is not a seeker after abolished pasts, but a hunter of sacred shades on the eternal hills." Those are words to write by for me. We can't go back.
Yeah, we can't go.
There's never a going back. We can't go back.
This is one of Heather and my principles. We cannot go back. There is, in fact, nowhere to go back to.
Exactly. There's nothing left to conserve. There's no going back.